Don't want to retire. I'm 70, as I said. I'd like to work to 75 to 80. I can't work that long if I lose my mental agility.
This information is, dare I say, mind-boggling. Hello, I'm Babette Davidson. I'm in the studio with Joe Campbell and Dr. Michael Merzenich, who is a neuroscientist and professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and an expert on brain plasticity. I've read that you can actually keep your brain fit by doing crossword puzzles. Is that the magic bullet? Is that what I need to do?
Well, anything you do with intensity that's serious and you're trying hard and you're really engaged is good for your brain. And in fact, a good heavy schedule in life of things like that is good for you and makes you a more interesting person. But it pays off because you have the ability to restore these age-related changes substantially, to rejuvenate the operations of the brain and to recover brain health.
Dr. Merzenich, can you tell us how these computer sessions work with the Brain Fitness program?
Yes, the program itself has 6 rather complicated exercises, but it's necessary to get to a lot in order to drive the changes that are necessary to make a real difference. The exercises are game-like. They're played on a computer, but it requires no special knowledge of the computer. Anybody can do this. It's not anything complicated. The software immediately adapts, so it immediately sets itself to a level in which you begin to make mistakes. That is to say, it's right on the cutting edge of what you can and can't do, and that's crucial. So in the first exercise, it's called high and low. You're trying to actually speed up the brain. You're also trying to sharpen it. Tell us apart is the second exercise in this program, and it gives the brain practice at making the distinctions in your receiving speech in fast forms that are the most difficult for you to get. In Match It, the third exercise, we're actually trying to generalize the fine distinctions that you've learned in the first 2 programs. In Sound Replay, we're pushing the brain to reconstruct sound in serial order. In Listen and Do, we're actually driving you to replay instructions of increasing length and complexity. And finally, in Storyteller, you're actually listening to a continuous narrative, and you're making distinctions in the continuous narrative.
As we have witnessed, our brain is capable of amazing change. But in order for change to occur, the situation and the stimuli must be optimal. Learning is occurring all of the time, whether we're aware of it or not. But what are the guiding principles that govern the plastic remodeling of the adult brain? What actually changes in the brain as you learn and remember? In order to drive positive change in the brain, there are 7 tenets of plasticity that we must utilize. Tenet number 1, change can occur only when the brain is in the mood.
Attention becomes a critical enabling factor in what you learn about, where change is allowed. Change primarily comes from the things that you pay attention to. If we're on the ball, if we're on fire, if we're really paying attention, if we're really engaged, that is contributing to changes in our brain that are going to facilitate change.
Brain plasticity is enabled by behavioral circumstances. If I'm alert, on the ball, ready for action, the brain releases those chemical neurotransmitters that enable brain change. You can think of them as on-off switches. When I'm in a learning or attentive, engaged mode, the brain is on and ready to change. If I'm disengaged or inattentive or paying attention to something else or performing an action that requires no real effort to succeed on my part, my switches are turned off. Tenet number 2, change strengthens connection between neurons engaged at the same time.
Sometimes the brain knows immediately that it has a good outcome. You know, like I put the quarter in the slot machine and the bells go off and there's $250 of worth of quarters coming down, right? I mean, sometimes it knows immediately, it doesn't have to guess, right? Other times it creates a model, commonly a model of some perfection in an activity. So if I'm trying to bounce a ball on a paddle, for instance, of course, the first time I do it, I might get 1 bounce and then there goes the ball. But I have this model and I'm weighing the value of tries. If I do it 3 times, wow, I'm improving. The brain says, good, save that one. Now what is it saving? It's saving that combination of connections that contribute to the good try, and it's making them a little stronger. So you can say in any behavior like this, the magic is selectivity. It's changing the connections selectively that contribute to the good try.
Tenet number 3, neurons that fire together, wire together. Things that we see or hear usually have many complexly related parts. The brain strengthens its connections between the things that reliably occur in serial time and makes predictions. By saving these connections, it has a capacity for continually making predictions about what goes with what and what comes next. They contribute greatly to the brain's reliable and stable actions.
I mean, the brain is a highly integrated organ, that there are components of activity that are occurring throughout the brain in all of our behaviors. It's relating it to past experiences. It's predicting what may happen in the future. And so it's not so compartmentalized in a way. Even vision, as we look at each other, you know, maybe I remind you of somebody that you met before, your long-lost uncle. And so you're having little images and memories of past visions that you've had. Or you like my tie. You've seen one like this in a store when you were walking down the street 2 weeks ago. So even though it's a simple sensory input, it's relating to other things that your brain has in it.
That's why when I think of, let's say, a farm, I might immediately jump in my mind to think about something like a field or pasture, or maybe a cow, or maybe the farmer. And that's because in my brain I store information as it relates to the probability that things concur, that things arise in my brain in successive time. The brain is actually constructing not just isolated representations of little pieces of the behavior that you're getting better at, it's actually constructing the sequence.
Tenet number 4, initial changes are just temporary. If the brain judges the experience to be inherently fascinating or novel, or if the behavioral outcome is a good or bad one, then they become permanent.
When something occurs that really engages our emotions, that really engages us powerfully, we know it's important, we never forget it, right? And it's because the brain basically is saying, save that one. The brain is deciding what to record. It's deciding what changes to enable, to strengthen.
It's important to understand that it's not just dramatic things that cause your brain to change its structure and its function. It's things that you're doing all the time. If you are watching this television show, you're changing your brain to some degree. But if you do something over and over again and you increase it incrementally, that's how you get major brain change that's more lasting.
Tenet number 5, brain plasticity is a two-way street, and we can either drive brain change positively or negatively.
Overall, the discovery of brain plasticity is very uplifting. But our plasticity also gets us into all sorts of difficulties as well. There are a number of disorders we've now discovered that in fact are explained in terms of plasticity. Some of the chronic pain syndromes are actually based on the plastic brain becoming very, very good at firing the pain signal. That would be one example. Virtually every bad habit we ever develop is actually a product of our brain plasticity. Our brain just gets very, very good at the bad habit, and it becomes very, very hard to shake. So once we discover that the brain is plastic, it means two things: that we have the power to change our brains much more than we ever believed. It's more malleable. But a malleable brain is also a vulnerable brain. And if you keep in mind that everything we do and everything we're bombarded with in a sensory way also is changing our brains, we realize that we're much more easily altered by the environment than we ever imagined.
Tenet number 6, memory is crucial for learning.
The brain is continually setting models of where learning is heading. And it's also remembering from moment to moment how we're doing in the progression of developing our skill or our ability. But it's also always evaluating against the model, and the model is held in memory. So in other words, I have a notion in my memory about what I'm trying to do. I know I'm trying to hit that ball. I know what I want to do. I know right where I want to hit it. Now I hit it, and I evaluate what the outcome is. If I thought about the movements it took, if I thought about all of the information that I had to get back from my arm and my body and how I had to control all of these muscles in order to get to do just that, I couldn't control that in 1,000 years. But the brain has this magical way of doing it. It just says, all of those complex combinations of things, those 101 things that require just to do that, save them.
Tenet number 7, motivation is a key factor in brain plasticity. When these plastic changes occur, the new networks are connected, and in some cases, a life can continue even after something as seemingly devastating as a stroke.
I was in medical school in Mexico City. Got a call and they said, come get your father. He's had a stroke and he's in very bad shape. My father had drive. He was not going to sit still for it. And he trusted me. And I said, we're going to do something about this. I don't know what, but we're going to do something about this. The only model for learning how to walk was the first model. Children, I said, this is what you did when you started to walk the first time. Let's see if you can do it the second time. And there was also a practical side. My father just hated being dependent. He could not tolerate being dependent. At first he was on his elbow, really, because he couldn't straighten his arm out properly. But after a while, he was crawling on hands and knees. And he got to the point where he could crawl up the stairs. Little by little, things came back. The more he struggled with it, the more came back.
Pedro Baquirita was basically cured by his therapy with his son George. He remarried, returned to his role as a professor at the City College of New York, and enjoyed a very active life. During this time, his other son, Paul Baquirita, was making a name for himself as a leading neuroscientist. When Pedro died, Paul requested an autopsy.
And a few days later, Paul was called into the pathologist's lab, and there, spread out before him on slides, were little bits of his father's brain. And Paul was revolted by this and numbed out, but the pathologist said, look at this. And what Paul realized was that the parts of the brain that had been destroyed and obliterated by the stroke were there to be seen. There had been massive damage. 97% of certain parts of the brain involved in movement had actually been destroyed. And a light bulb went off for Paul because he realized suddenly that what his father's brain had done in that work with George was reorganize itself so that parts that weren't originally involved in those movements took over. And this was a great watershed for Paul because suddenly he realized that the brain of an older person could be fantastically plastic.
Baquirita had such remarkable success with his therapy because he put his focus not on the skill, like walking, but how the skill was acquired, the learning process. That is how changes take place in our brain, through new skill acquisition. But it has to be the right type of learning to direct positive plastic changes.
The brain wants you to work on refining your abilities that are slipping. It wants you to be engaged again so that when you're listening to a conversation, you're really listening, not just sort of half listening. So that when you're out in the world, you're really paying attention and you're living out and you see the flower again and you see the shine on it as the sun reflects on it. In a sense, the brain is asking you to be young again in your attitude. It's asking you to have your eyes sparkle again with life. It's asking you to take up new challenges. It's asking you to take life seriously again. It's asking you to be engaged with power and vigor and energy and intensity. So I think one of the deadliest things that happens in a modern life is that we imagine that the good life is a life that in a sense is the withdrawn and the controlled and the boring life of the mundane, all of those things that we're good at, that pretty soon nobody else is that interested in knowing about because we reduce ourselves, we simplify. We become the older person that has relatively little to talk about and certainly relatively little new. And we seek comfort as opposed to novelty, as opposed to a new perspective, as opposed to a new